Welcome to Question Period on this Sunday, November 17th. I'm Vashi Capellos. Today, policy pivot?
If they want to have a Team Canada approach, it means the emissions cap has to be off the table.
After Donald Trump's re-election, Alberta is finding new allies in its opposition to Ottawa's climate policies. Justin Trudeau's own former finance minister says the government needs to reassess implementing an oil and gas emissions cap. Will the Prime Minister be more receptive to an alternative agenda? Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith will be here. Then, leveraging loyalty.
Politics is tough, and it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today.
President-elect Trump is wasting no time picking his cabinet, and this time, the Loyalists are being rewarded. What do Trump's picks mean for Ottawa's Team Canada approach? The Sunday strategy session will be here to weigh in on that. Plus, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's former chief of staff and former ambassador in Washington, Derek Burney, will be here to tell us why, in his view, defense spending should be priority number one for the feds.
We're going to need to think about, whether we focus on energy security in a way that makes us clearly an important part of the U.S. sector that way. And that means we have to ask ourselves, is it really the right time for caps on emissions?
Former Liberal Finance Minister Bill Morneau there calling on the federal government to consider delaying its emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. Why? The imminent return of Donald Trump to the White House. He says Ottawa should be focused on policies that better align Canada with the incoming administration. His comments were welcomed by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who has long been a vocal critic of Ottawa's plans to regulate the sector. But when I put Morneau's comments this week to Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, he rejected the idea of a delay outright. With me now to talk more about this is Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith. Hi, Premier. Good to see you as always. Thanks for making the time.
You bet. Thanks, Vashi.
I wanted to start off on that cap because you have been opposed to it from the start. The federal government says bending on it now would throw their climate plan into jeopardy, even when the new administration south of the border is taken into account. Don't they have a point there?
No, they don't. I mean, not bending on some of the direction they've taken, it will jeopardize our relationship with the United States, which is the largest trading relationship that we have, not only Alberta, but all of our provincial counterparts. We know one of the things that the new White House wants is energy security. We have the ability to offer that. And if you put on the table an emissions cap, which we know will cause a cap in production, you're not going to be able to negotiate in a way that's going to be best for Canada. So if they want to have a Team Canada approach, it means the emissions cap has to be off the table.
How do you know for certain that it would amount to a production cap? You've been critical of the impact of climate policies levied so far by the federal government, and yet this year there are record exports to the United States of oil and gas, and there are oil specifically, I should say, and there is also a record level of production of that. So how do you know for sure that what the federal government is proposing, which by the way is even on the low end of what they had floated a number of months ago, is necessarily going to be a production cap?
Well, it's because you have to wait for the technology to develop. And one of the ways in which our industry is going to decarbonize is by rolling out small modular reactors. We know that the time frame for developing the regulatory environment and getting those implemented is no sooner than 2035. So if you set targets for 2030, and 2035, the only way to reach them, if you don't have the technology on emissions reduction, is to shut in production. It's really just simple math. What we have always been advocating for is give industry the time frame that they need, which they say is 2050, so that we have time to develop the technology, implement the technology, develop out carbon capture, utilization, and storage, build that pipeline infrastructure, bring in new types of power sources. You can't do that with the snap of a fingers. You certainly can't do that within the short time frame that they've talked about. And so the only option is a production cap, and we'll be fighting that every step of the way.
To that point, there is some flexibility, some compliance flexibility built into the plan. And beyond that, again, when you talk about all the technological development, you're taking industry's word for how long it's going to take. Ultimately, if they don't develop the technology, then the alternative for them is to cut production. But isn't that on them?
Well, I would say that we have to work on a timescale that operates in the real world. We know that carbon capture, utilization, and storage does work. We've already safely stored 14 megatons of CO2 emissions, but we also know that it takes a long time with permitting and approval, with Indigenous consultation, with landowner consultation, and the timescales for getting things built. That can't be done in 5 years. Everyone knows that. And so I think that the reason why the federal government has put forward such aggressive targets is because they want to sell it to the public as an emissions cap, knowing full well it is a production cap and it's a violation of the Constitution. And that's why we will continue to fight against it.
Is there a chance, though, that they are actually trying to ensure that those companies that you reference, that industry that you reference, actually does more than pay lip service to reducing emissions? I mean, the oil patch is a huge economic boon to this country. There is no way I would take away from the contribution that it makes to the Canadian economy. But it also contributes, to the emissions, the overall emissions. It's 30% of all the emissions in this country. If you slow down the process of reducing those emissions, like, how can you say that you're really about fighting the effects of climate change?
Look, if they wanted to show me they were serious, they would say that they're, as part of declaring their climate emergency, they're going to fast track the approvals on developments. They would give the money to build the pipeline so it could be done in 1 year. They would assist us in developing a regulatory environment so that we could roll out small modular reactors in 2 years. I'm not hearing any of that discussion. They aren't interested in changing the regulatory approval process. They aren't interested in working with us on streamlining some of those approvals. If we wanted to fast track things so that they could have a faster implementation, then I'm sure the industry would work with them. But what they're asking the industry to do is the impossible. Is that they're asking them to go through a regulatory process that they know will take decades and then meet these emissions targets within 5 years. And the only way to do it is a production cap. That's why we have been fighting against it. We've said if we need to have the longer time frame to unfold this, then give a longer time frame so that we have the ability to continue doing our production.
Is it your position, based on what you just said, that if the federal government were to change the regulatory process, for example, to issue permits faster, that actually it is feasible for the technology to meet those deadlines? Because that's what it sounded like.
The first small modular reactor, as I understand it, is being rolled out in Darlington in 2026. And once you've established the framework for that, it should be fairly straightforward to be able to roll it out elsewhere. We've never had nuclear in our province, but when I talk to the officials about what it would take to get there, they're telling me the earliest is 2035. Look, I mean, we have to understand the reason why tens of billions of dollars have left our country is because of a federal regulatory process where there is no end in sight. We lost the Tech Frontier mine. We lost Energy East. We've lost multi-billion-dollar projects because the federal government has created such a convoluted process where there isn't a clear pathway to finishing. So I'm not going to hold out hope that all of a sudden they're going to see the light after 9 years and come up with a process that's going to allow this. If it's going to take the time, we need to give industry the time to be able to do it. And we simply are not going to agree to any kind of arbitrary emissions cap that we know will shut in our production. We're just not going to do it.
And I do understand your point about concerns when it comes to the regulatory process more generally. But I remember covering all those issues along the way. And there were, segments of the population who felt they would be directly impacted by the development of that. And then even wider swaths of the population who felt that they would increase production to a level that would negatively impact emissions growth insofar as emissions would grow at an even more rapid rate. And climate change impacts would grow as a result of that in turn. And so the opposition, was real. It wasn't just fabricated by the government. It wasn't just because their regulatory process wasn't great, which I know the criticism is valid of. Like, there were real concerns. Those concerns still exist.
But look, here's the future as I see it, that natural gas is a build out to what will ultimately be a hydrogen economy. Those same networks are going to be used to transport hydrogen, which has zero emissions. I look at our development of bitumen, because 6,000 different products can come from a barrel of oil, and one of the most valuable ones is asphalt, which my understanding is 60% of the product goes to make, or lubricants or other types of petrochemicals. Increasingly over time, we will have non-combustion uses for these products. We will have construction uses for these products. We just have to decarbonize at the production end. And I've mentioned the way we would do that. We do it through carbon capture, and we would also do it through small modular reactors. There is a future for natural gas and conventional oil and bitumen that allows for us to continue developing it. I think that the framework that the federal government present is that they believe that this industry is going to be phased out. It is not going to be phased out. The emissions are going to be phased out. We are still going to have a very robust bitumen, oil, and gas exporting market, and that's why we can't do anything that's going to compromise it prematurely.
I did want to, as I promised, ask you about what's going on south of the border, and in particular, the speculation that if there are any imports or exports of imports into the U.S. that are exempt from the tariff that Donald Trump is threatening of 10% across the board, it's going to be energy exports. You have just joined up with a group of governors who are talking about energy security. Have you had anyone in or near Donald Trump assure you that that could be the case?
I've had a couple of interesting conversations. I've had a chance to meet with Robert Lighthizer at a dinner last year, and I've read his book. He talks about fair trade. He believes fair trade is that we buy as much product from the U.S. as they buy from us. I asked him in particular about energy, and he's very enthusiastic about the Canadian energy sector. I asked him as well what we would need to do in order to have a more constructive relationship with the United States, and he said take a Canada First approach because as we've seen, Mexico is continuing to invite China to invest in Mexico, which is hollowing out the manufacturing sector in both America as well as Canada, and we've got to put Canada first. So that would be one reason why I think we have the ability to use our oil and gas as a way of meeting the federal government's national energy security needs. And I've had an opportunity to talk with Doug Burgum as well, who was the North Dakota governor until recently. He's now going to be Interior Secretary, and as Interior Secretary, that role plays a coordinating role on getting pipelines built. So I'm looking forward to having that discussion about how we can get more of our product to the United States.
Do you think during the campaign Trump talked about Keystone? Do you think that is a possibility again?
I think that more egress is absolutely a possibility. Whether the alignment from Keystone is the one, or whether it's going on an existing right-of-way and twinning existing pipelines that exist, I think that is a very active conversation. It's one I've been having for the last number of months, and I'm looking forward to participating with the 12 other governors who believe that this is important so that we can advance that.
Your predecessor put some provincial money into trying to get Keystone moving forward, to great criticism when it was stopped. Would you put provincial taxpayer money into another pipeline?
Look, I don't love that idea. I think unfortunately we have such the federal government has created so much uncertainty on approvals that industry is now looking for some kind of way that governments can de-risk projects. I think that was part of the reason why Premier Kenney had made that decision. But look, if we can develop a collaborative approach with the United States and be able to get movement on actually getting that pipeline built in the next 4 years, I do believe that the private sector is prepared to do that work.
Just quickly before I let you go, Premier, you mentioned Mexico. One of your provincial counterparts in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford, suggested this week that in any renegotiation of a free trade deal, that the federal government drop Mexico essentially and go bilateral rather with the United States. Would you support that?
1,000%. Yeah. Premier Doug Ford and I've had a conversation with that, and he's absolutely right. Mexico's gone in a different direction, and it's pretty clear that the Americans have indicated that they want to have a fair trade relationship. Mexico's not in a position to be able to offer that, especially with the investment that they have from China. We've got to put Canada first. Our province has a $188 billion trade relationship with the United States. We have a $2.9 billion trade relationship with Mexico. It's important, but our absolute number one priority is maintaining those strong trade ties with the United States. And if that requires us to do a bilateral agreement, then that's what we should do.
Premier, I'll leave it on that note. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vashi.